So in the last couple of talks, we've really been talking about architecture and its relationship to a larger world, the people who use it, individuals, society, and that's actually going to be primarily the focus of the class. But today, we're going to reach back here at the beginning of the course and think a little bit about the architect's role in all this. How do we understand architecture from the point of view of the people who design and make architecture? So today we're focusing on the architects and in particular on the values of architects. So probably for most of you in about, I don't know, 7th or 8th grade, you had a math teacher who distinguished the difference between determinate problems and indeterminate problems, or in math, determinate equations and indeterminate equations. So a determinate equation is like 2x equals 30. Obviously, x equals 15. There's one and only one answer to that problem, one and only one solution to that problem. And then there are indeterminate equations that are very different from that, where it might be like 2x plus 3y plus z equals 35. And obviously, a number of different combinations of x, y, and z could solve that problem. There's not one and only one answer to that problem. Now, in architecture, we do not have determinate problems. Many fields do have determinate problems. People spend all day, every day in those fields answering a question with the one right answer. But in architecture, we just don't have determinate problems. We have indeterminate problems, where no matter what you know about the problem, if you know exactly the climate this building's going to be in, you know exactly the site and where the trees are and the topography, and you know all of the economic constraints of the problem, you know exactly what all the functions are that need to be in this building, you know exactly the psychology of the users and what they're like, you know everything about this problem. You research the heck out of it. Still, there is not one solution to that problem. There's not an inevitable answer to that problem. So if I gave the simplest of design problems to a design studio, let's say we were going to design a dog house, super simple structure, and I had 20 people in my design studio. I could give that dog house as a problem, and I would get 20 completely different solutions. Some student might say, man, I am going to make the ultimate sustainable doghouse. I'm going to use totally recycled materials. I'm going to worry about exactly how it sits in the landscape and the drainage around it, and I'm going to make it completely climate responsive so little Fido is warm in the wintertime and cool in the summertime with absolutely no supplement. I mean, that could be an approach, and you'd get one kind of doghouse. Somebody else might say, no, I am going to make one badass, amazing, iconic object that sits in the backyard and is a conversation piece, and everybody focuses on how weird and odd and cool that doghouse is. And that's my goal here. But that's another completely different kind of design. Or you might have somebody who says, you know, I want to get to know Fido. Is this a lethargic dog? Is this a super active dog? Is it possible Fido may someday have babies? How do I need to accommodate that? And I'm really sincerely wanting to make a home for Fido. All of those are different approaches to what is an indeterminate problem. And you're going to get a wide range of solutions to that problem. So it's very important to understand that all architectural problems are indeterminate equations. Now, how do you go about approaching that indeterminate equation? I think in the very best of cases, architects bring values to the problem. They bring their own predilections, their own prejudices, their own concerns, their own interests, their own theory of what they think architecture is about and what's important in architecture. And that, when combined with all of those constants, the site, the program, the climate, all of those things, they then begin to make a solution to a problem. They begin to close the indeterminacy of the problem. So today we're really looking at architectural values. How do architects acquire those values? How are those values important in making good architecture? I think in the absence of clear values, you can solve that indeterminate equation, but that's kind of what we call bad architecture. The really good architecture is where the designer is very much in control of what they are bringing to the problem and what values they're using to help solve that problem. So we're interested today in how people acquire values and what's involved in that, and then how that influences architectural design. So I would say there are 4 primary ways that an architect acquires values. Part of it is really about their personality. I'm a gregarious person, I'm a quiet person. I'm a very loud person, I'm a very quiet person. I'm a very introspective person. I absorb other people's ideas. These are all personality traits, and they go into shaping values. A second thing that influences values is the experience you have. If I grew up in Muleshoe, Texas, and lived in a rural area all my childhood, I went to Texas Tech to architecture school. I then moved back to Muleshoe, 100 miles away from Texas Tech, and had my practice there and was dealing with the people I'd been familiar with all my life. I would have a certain set of experiences that would shape my values. If, on the other hand, I had been an Army brat, I lived all over the world as a kid, I went to undergraduate school in Boston, and then I did graduate work in London, and I'd lived in many different cultures and been exposed to many different things. Those experiences would also shape my values. So experiences are a second thing. A third thing that shapes values is definitely the time we live in. Things that are in the air, ideas that we're exposed to. And that's constant in any time. These days, we're very conscious of sustainability, issues of global warming, what we're doing to our planet. But 25, 30 years ago, the term global warming hardly existed. The term sustainability was just beginning to be in parlance. So in our time, we're inclined to think about some values that in another area would not be the case. And 25 years from now, there may be another set of values that are in the air and we might absorb. So it is your own personality, it is your experiences, it's the time you're living in, and then the fourth thing is really all of that is filtered through our own judgment. We make decisions about what we want to believe in. We make decisions about what we care about. And it is really an intentional thing of setting those values that then could contribute enormously to formulating the kind of design an architect does. So we're filming this talk at the Harry Ransom Center on the UT campus. And this is a big research facility. It's full of archives. And it is in some ways perfect for the content we're talking about here, because we've been talking about architects and their values. And this research center is full of the archives of people who are in value-laden disciplines. Disciplines that have indeterminate equations, and they rely on people having values that help bring solutions to the problems they're dealing with. So in here are the work of photographers, painters, sculptors, filmmakers, authors, people who do great literature. James Joyce's collection is in here. And the great thing about it is the HRC tends to collect a whole archive, all of the papers and works of a person. And I spent many, many hours in here years ago when I was studying the work of an architect designer named Norman Bel Geddes. And so I was trying to understand his values. And I could read almost everything he ever wrote. I could see almost everything he ever designed. I could read his correspondence. I could get to know who he was and understand his values and how his values helped shape the kind of work he did. These etchings on the corners of the building here are really describing the work that's inside. And this particular one, I love the fact it's in such a prominent location. This is actually a car that was designed by Norman Bel Geddes in the 1930s. So to understand why Norman Bel Geddes designed a car like that, you have to kind of understand who Norman Bel Geddes was and what he brought to the design problem of how do you make a car. Now today, we're going to be focusing on 3 different architects, and we're going to be looking at their values. And I selected 3 architects who have practiced in the same place at the same time. And so they're not so much, their work is not different because it's in different geographies. Their work is not different because it's in a different era. But their work is very different. These 3 architects are doing very, very different work. But it's because they have very, very different values. So for the rest of this talk, let's delve into the values of these 3 very interesting architects practicing in the 1930s in Berlin. So this period of the 1930s in Germany was a real hotbed of architectural discussion. And these 3 architects were all 3 representing very different approaches. And there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of argument about what were the right values to have in architecture in that place at that time. So the first of these people was a guy named Hugo Herring. And Hugo Herring was this impish, very, very small, short, slight guy. He was had a very outgoing personality. He was very outspoken. There were these clubs, architecture and art clubs in Berlin, and they would have exhibitions and events and publications and about architectural ideas. And Hugo Herring was very involved in one of them called Der Ring. He was an officer in Der Ring. He wrote articles a lot in their publications. So he's this very kind of outspoken, but physically kind of tiny, nebbish looking guy. So I would say that there are 2 kind of broad values that we could attribute to Hugo Herring. Hugo Herring, in a very general sense, believed that advances in culture depend on individuals. That if we're ever going to have really great societies, we need to encourage individuals to be just the most they can possibly be. Self-actualization of each individual person. In that way, he was all over democracy. Another kind of broad worldview thing, he believed that nature is man's great teacher. He had a great appreciation for nature. This is a kind of strain of German philosophy. It goes back to Johann Wolfgang Goethe, other people, where nature is really the nurturing force in culture or society. And Herring believed that. And then I would say there are 5 more architectural values we could attribute to Hugo Herring. He believed, for example, that design is a very intuitive, emotional, almost spiritual process. You have to kind of get in the zone. You have to feel this problem, and then you get your best ideas and your best approach. So if he didn't feel like he was in the right frame of mind for designing, he would sometimes go out and take a walk in the woods, and that would help inspire him. Or he also was very fond of listening to music while he designed, because it put him in a more emotional frame of mind. So he believed that design is a very emotional process. A second kind of architectural value, he believed that beauty is relative. If a little kid sees a mangy mongrel dog and embraces that dog and says, "Oh, what a beautiful puppy," that in fact that is a legitimate beauty. In the eyes of that child, that puppy is beautiful. There's no greater standard for beauty. Beauty is relative. A third architectural value that Haring had was he believed that each building should be unique, that the architect needs to research and understand each particular building situation, and out of that will come a very unique and specific solution to that problem. So he was very disciplined in working his ass off to find exactly the right solution to each individual problem. A fourth value, and this was a really big thing for Haring, he believed that function is above all the greatest criteria for architecture. If the architecture is not functioning right, if you're not really understanding the behavior, the activities, the patterns that are going on in that place, then you've missed it. Function is above all the big criteria we should be using in architecture. And then the fifth and final architectural value, he believed that the building's character or visual expression should be very much based on function, that it should express what's going on in the building. You should see the human behavior and activity exemplified and personified in the building. So that's kind of a quick and dirty view of Hugo Haring, but you can get the sense of this guy that has some broad world values, and then those incline him toward some specific architectural values. So let's put Hugo over in the corner over there for a minute, and let's talk about a second architect, a guy named Mies van der Rohe. Now, Mies van der Rohe was a very, very famous, internationally famous architect eventually. Hugo Haring, much less well known, but Mies van der Rohe got to be very, very successful. But in their early careers in the 1930s, actually Hugo Haring and Mies van der Rohe shared an office space. They didn't share projects, but they had their offices in the same space, and they were very good friends. They disagreed on just about everything, but they had respect for each other and they were good friends. So Mies was very different in appearance to Hugo Haring. Mies was tall, he was elegant, he was a handsome guy in his youth. He was kind of a ladies' man and kind of the opposite of Hugo Haring's appearance. He also was a very kind of quiet guy, whereas Haring was so outgoing. Mies was much more reticent. He was a man of few words. When he immigrated to the United States in the late 1930s, and his English wasn't perfect, and many people thought that he didn't say very much because he was self-conscious of his language difficulties. But the people who knew him well said, nah, I mean, Mies never said anything in Germany either. He just is a man of few words. So he was quite different from Haring in that regard too. Now, in terms of values, Mies had some values that were kind of overriding worldview values. He believed that, whereas Haring believed that the individual was so important, Mies believed that if a society is really going to advance, it depends on its institutions. It depends on great universities. It depends on great financial institutions. It depends on great corporations. It depends on strong governments. All of these institutions that if you're thinking you're going to optimize every freaking individual, that's impossible. That's never going to happen. But to advance society, you need these great institutions. Another kind of worldview value, he believed that, he wasn't so keen on nature, but he believed that it was the collective knowledge of the Western tradition that really was man's great teacher. It was that classical education in philosophy and in science. That's really where we're going to advance. And things that were begun in Greece and Rome and are progressing through European culture up to his time. It was those things in science and in mathematics and in arts and in all of those things are where we get our strength, and we build on that as a society. And then he also had what I could identify as 5 architectural values that, again, kind of came out of those larger values. He believed, for example, as a kind of primary thing, that design is a very rational process, that you can, in fact, organize yourself, be very analytical. You can understand your values precisely. You can plug them in a kind of analytical way. And you can make a process that, no matter what mood you're in, it's a rational process. And with discipline, you can simply execute that rational process. He also believed that there were some constraints on what is beautiful. That little mangy dog that kid sees, that dog is not beautiful. That's a mongrel and it's got the mange and it's ugly. That there are universals about beauty and it is not relative and is not in the eye of the beholder. There are things we can understand about beauty. He also believed that architecture needed to be kind of according to ideals and that every building couldn't be unique. He was fond of saying, I can't invent a new architecture every Monday morning. He thought that there were broad sets of forms and standards that could be widely applied to a lot of different buildings. So at a certain point he was designing an office building for the Bacardi Rum Company in Havana, Cuba. And at the same time he was designing an art museum for contemporary art in Berlin. Completely opposite climates, completely opposite cultures, completely opposite functions. But if I'm not real careful when I look at images of those two buildings, I get them mixed up. They look very much the same. He did not believe that every building needed to be unique. He believed that there are sets of forms that can be broadly applied, and he couldn't invent a new architecture every Monday morning. A fourth value of Mies van der Rohe, he believed that architecture should express the spirit of its age. He felt like he was in a period in the middle of the 20th century when technology was advancing very quickly. The Industrial Revolution had made a huge contribution. It was time for us to embrace this spirit of the age that had to do with technology, had to do with machines, had to do with mass production. Architecture needed to embrace all of that. And a fifth and final value of Mies van der Rohe, he believed that construction is above all the major criteria for architecture. He believed that you don't design a building and then figure out how to build it. The act of building shapes the building. The act of construction is very much a primary input in the character and the look and the feel of that building. His family had been masons, they were bricklayers, and he came from a construction kind of point of view. And construction was very, very important. Structural behavior and the way you put materials together, that was really what was the seminal element of architecture. So again, let's take Mies, his broad views, his architectural values, put them aside for a moment. And the third architect I want us to talk about is a guy named Albert Speer. Now, Albert Speer is very, very different from the other two. He was a decade younger than Mies van der Rohe and Hugo Herring. He did not run in the same circles as them at all. He had been born to a very privileged family. He got the very best education possible. He had an uncle that was a very famous architect in Germany. He was kind of plugged into a higher echelon of society than Hugo Herring or Mies van der Rohe. Some of you may know he was Adolf Hitler's architect. And there's a very interesting story there. Adolf Hitler himself wanted to be an architect. He went to architecture school, spent a couple of years in architecture school. The program he was in, after a couple of years, you had a review, the faculty looking at the work you'd done up to that point, and they would advise you whether they thought you should stay in architecture or look for another major. So he was seemingly fairly successful in architecture school, but when it came to that evaluation, he did not do well. And the faculty told him, we think you ought to move on to some other discipline. So he was out of the program. I think that was very disappointing to him. It took some soul searching at that point. Okay, if I'm not going to be an architect, what shall I do? Oh, maybe I'll just rule the world. Yeah, okay, I'll do that instead of being an architect. So he found an alternative career. But he continued to have a very, very large interest in architecture. And when he began to rise to prominence in the Nazi Party and in Germany, he understood that architecture is a tool for advancing my cause. And he actually went back and hired one of his old professors to be the architect who would work on all of the projects that were involved in helping him build his position in the Third Reich. Then, interestingly, after only a few years of working with his professor as an architect, his professor had a heart attack and died very suddenly. So Hitler is without an architect. And so he then selects Albert Speer, and we'll look at that a little later in another talk. But that meant that Albert Speer, at a very young age, was thrown into a kind of very sophisticated career in architecture. So Albert Speer also had 5 of what we could term as architectural values. They're very different from the values of Mies van der Rohe and Hugo Herring. So he believed that architecture is a means of communication, that it's a vehicle for disseminating ideas, and in his case, a vehicle for communicating the ideas of Adolf Hitler and of the Third Reich and of promoting that kind of political position. So architecture was a tool for communicating ideas. A second value is he believed that any individual building should express its general role in society. So if you're doing a residential building, it should be very domestic, very comfortable, very intimate. It should have a kind of character that has to do with what a home is. And that should be very different from an industrial building, which should be very logical, very efficient, very economical, kind of no frills. And it would produce a completely different kind of architecture and expression if you were doing an industrial building. And that would be very different from if you were doing a building for government or a building for a prestigious institution, where it would be more about elevating the sense of power or prominence of that government or that institution in the society. So buildings should really express their general role in the culture. A third very prominent architectural value is he believed that drama and awe and wonder, oh my God, those are the best architecture gets. That's what you want to do. You want to make buildings that just knock people on their ass and they're just full of drama and wonder. That's what he loved in architecture. A fourth architectural value, he genuinely believed that architecture is a ticket to immortality. He wanted to be famous, and he wanted his work to live on beyond him. He was very, very interested in the immortality that architecture could give to the people involved in making it. A fifth architectural value, he believed that the classical periods, Greece, Rome, the architecture produced in those periods is the best it ever got. And we need to be learning from that, and we need to be advancing those ideas and forms and character that we can see in classical architecture of Greece and Rome. So, as I said, these are like really just quick snapshots of the values of Hugo Herring, the values of Mies van der Rohe, the values of Albert Speer, how those values came from, their personalities and their backgrounds, and how they created very different value systems in these three people. And in the next talk, we're going to be looking at the work of these three people and seeing how different, and how amazingly different the work was because of these tremendous differences in values. Okay, see you next time.